Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the quiet corridors of history. Tonight, we invite you to settle back, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift into the America of the 1860s, a time when the very fabric of a young nation was being tested, thread by thread, in ways both profound and intimate. Please consider subscribing to the channel and hit the like button as you rest there in the comfort of your modern surroundings. Imagine for a moment stepping back through time to an era when the sound of distant cannon fire might echo across peaceful farmland, when families gathered around flickering oil lamps to read letters that might never come again, and when the simple act of choosing which road to take could mean the difference between safety and peril. The American Civil War was not just a conflict of grand battles and political speeches, was a tapestry woven from millions of individual moments, small decisions, and quiet acts of endurance. Tonight, we'll walk together through the daily rhythms of those who lived through this extraordinary time. From the muddy camps where soldiers wrote letters home by candlelight, to the hidden networks of courage that moved like whispers through the darkness, to the grand ballrooms where life continued, its elaborate dance, even as the world outside began to crumble. Let yourself sink deeper into comfort as we begin this gentle exploration of a time when ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances, and discover how the human spirit adapts, endures, and finds moments of beauty even in the midst of profound uncertainty. The past awaits us, patient and quiet, ready to share its stories in the soothing cadence of history's gentle voice. The morning mist clings to the rolling hills of Virginia, and you find yourself walking along a dirt road that has been transformed by countless boots, hooves, and wagon wheels into something resembling a river of churned earth. The year is 1863, and this landscape, once pastoral and serene now, bears the subtle but unmistakable marks of a nation at war with itself. You pause for a moment, breathing an air that carries the faint scent of wood smoke and something else, something harder to define, the metallic temps of uncertainty that seem to permeate everything in these border regions where armies have passed, like storm clouds, leaving change in their wake. As you continue down this road, imagine the families who lived here, caught between two worlds that at once seemed so clearly defined. The Hendersons, perhaps, who owned a modest farm just beyond that stand of oak trees, their neat wooden house now bearing the weathered look of people who have learned to listen carefully to every distant sound. Mrs. Henderson would rise each morning before dawn, not just from habit, but from necessity. The rhythms of wartime demanded constant vigilance, constant preparation for the possibility that the day might bring unwelcome visitors in blue or gray uniforms. Picture her moving through her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to waste nothing, not time, not resources, not hope. The coffee, if there was any to be had, would be stretched with chicory root or roasted grain. Its bitter warmth, a luxury that connected her briefly to the comfortable world that existed before brother took arms against brother. The breakfast table, once abundant with fresh eggs and milk from their own animals, now held whatever could be spared after the necessities of survival had been calculated and recalculated with the precision of a military quartermaster. The children young, Thomas, barely 14, and little Mary, still innocent at 8, would gather around that table with the quiet demeanor of those who have learned too early that voices carry farther than adults once believed, and that words spoken carelessly might reach the wrong ears. Thomas has grown thin over these past months, not from lack of food exactly, but from the peculiar stress of a boy trying to become a man in a world where the definitions of courage and loyalty shift like shadows throughout the day. He helps his father in the fields, but his eyes are always scanning the horizon, watching for the telltale dust clouds that might signal the approach of soldiers. Any soldiers. Mr. Henderson himself has developed the careful neutrality of a man who understands that survival sometimes requires the diplomacy of the powerless. When Union forces passed through last spring, he offered water from his well and spoke carefully of the weather, the crops, anything but politics. When Confederate raiders came through in summer, he did precisely the same, his face a study in the practiced emptiness of someone who has learned that opinions are luxuries he cannot afford. His neighbors, the ones who remain, have developed similar skills, the ability to read the approaching intentions of strangers by the set of their shoulders, the way they hold their weapons, the particular quality of dust their horses kick up. On the dry road, the Henderson farm, like thousands of others scattered across Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and beyond, has become a small island of stubborn normalcy in an ocean of upheaval. The cows still need milking, the chickens still need feeding, the vegetables still need tending. Now these simple tasks are performed with one ear, always listening for the sound of hoofbeats. One eye, always watching the tree line. Mrs. Henderson has learned to bake bread that can be hidden quickly, to smoke meat that can be buried if necessary, to maintain a garden that looks modest, enough to avoid attracting attention while still providing the nutrients her family desperately needs. The social fabric of their community has been rewoven by the strange mathematics of civil conflict. The Millers, who lived just down the road, sent their eldest son south to join Lee's army. The Weatherbys sent theirs north to serve under Grant. Sunday services at the small Methodist church have become exercises in careful omission. Prayers are offered for all our boys, for those in harm's way, for peace in our time. But specific names are mentioned quietly. In private conversations after the formal service has ended, imagine yourself sitting on the Hendersons' front porch as evening approaches. The setting, sun painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seem almost criminally beautiful given the weight of the times. The sounds of this summer evening are subtly different from what they would have been 5 years ago. There are fewer dogs barking in the distance, fewer children's voices carrying across the fields. Some families have simply vanished, packed up and moved to places they hoped might be safer, leaving behind empty houses that stand like monuments to dreams deferred. But there are other sounds now, sounds that have become part of the ordinary music of daily life. The distant rumble of supply wagons moving along the main roads, the occasional sharp crack of rifle fire from hunting parties or nervous sentries, the low conversations of men who gather at the country store to share. Whatever news has filtered through from the wider world of battles and politics, these sounds have become so familiar that their absence would now seem more ominous than their presence. It is the silence that speaks of armies massing, decisions being made in distant places that will reshape the landscape of everyday life. Mrs. Henderson has developed relationships with other women in similar situations. Canned together, they have created an informal network of mutual support that operates beneath the official notice of military authorities from either side. They share information about which roads are safe for travel, which merchants can still be trusted to deliver goods without asking too many questions, which doctors are still available to treat civilians. These women have learned to communicate in the coded language of domestic concerns. Recipes shared might contain information about troop movements. A request to borrow a particular book might signal the need for medical supplies. An invitation to help with canning might indicate that someone's husband has returned safely from a scouting expedition. The children, meanwhile, have adapted to this new reality with the frightening resilience of youth. They play games that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier, soldiers and spies, where the rules change depending on who might be watching. And victory is measured not by capture, but by successful concealment. Young Mary has learned to hide small treasures in places where searching soldiers are unlikely to look. And she takes pride in her ability to appear completely innocent while shepherding important family documents to secret locations. Thomas has developed an uncanny ability to identify different types of military formations from great distances. knowledge that might someday prove crucial to his family's survival. The rhythm of their days has been shaped by the peculiar combination of tedium and vigilance that characterizes life in a contested region. Long stretches of apparent normalcy are punctuated by sudden moments of intensity, a stranger asking questions at the general store, a column of smoke rising from the direction of the county seat, the sound of rapid hoofbeats on the road at an unusual hour. During these moments, the Hendersons and their neighbors shift into a heightened state of awareness, communicating through glances and subtle gestures the accumulated wisdom of people who have learned to read danger in the smallest details. Their evenings are often spent in activities that serve multiple purposes. Mrs. Henderson might mend clothes or listening for any unusual sounds from outside, while Mr. Henderson sharpens tools that could serve as weapons if necessary while maintaining the appearance of routine farm maintenance. The children do their lessons by oil lamp, but their primers now include maps of local roads and lessons in recognizing the distinctive insignia of various military units. Education has taken on a practical urgency that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. These children are learning skills that might literally save their lives. As autumn settles over the Virginia countryside, the Henderson family's world has contracted and expanded simultaneously in ways that would have seemed impossible just 2 years ago. The physical universe has shrunk to the boundaries of what can be safely reached and returned from in a single day, perhaps a radius of 5 miles on a good day, less when tensions run high. Yet, their awareness of distant events has become acute in ways that connect them to battlefields hundreds of miles away. Every letter that reaches the local post office, for every traveler who stops at the general store, every peddler who ventures down their country road brings fragments of a larger story that directly impacts their daily decisions. The harvest season, once a time of community celebration and shared labor, has become an exercise in careful calculation and quiet cooperation. Mrs. Henderson rises even earlier now, before the first pale light touches the eastern horizon, to begin the work of preserving what they can, while preparing for the possibility that they might need to abandon everything with little notice. The root cellar beneath their kitchen floor has been expanded and reinforced, not just to store vegetables through the winter, but to serve as a hiding place for anything of value: family papers, her grandmother's silver spoons, the small leather pouch containing their savings in gold coins. The corn harvest presents particular challenges that would never have occurred to them in peacetime. The stalks must be cut and gathered with an eye toward concealment. Too much activity in the fields might attract unwanted attention, but too little might result in starvation when winter arrives. Mr. Henderson has learned to work in patterns that appear random from a distance, harvesting sections of the field in a way that maintains the appearance of neglect, while actually following a careful plan designed to maximize yield while minimizing visibility. Young Thomas has become invaluable during these autumn weeks, his adolescent energy channeled into the kind of backbreaking labor that builds both physical strength and emotional resilience. He can now load a wagon with the same efficiency as a man twice his age, and he has developed an intuitive understanding of how to arrange corn stalks and pumpkins in ways that make the load appear smaller and less valuable than it actually is. More importantly, he has learned to read the landscape with the eyes of someone who understands that survival often depends on being unremarkable, blending so completely into the background of rural life that passing soldiers see nothing worth investigating. The preservation of food has become both art and science in the Henderson household. Mrs. Henderson has mastered techniques that her own mother never needed to learn. How to smoke meat in ways that minimize telltale aromas. How to dry vegetables so they can be quickly reconstituted when needed. How to prepare foods that will remain edible even if buried underground for weeks at a time. Her pantry has been reorganized according to principles of concealment and portability. The most valuable item, salt, sugar, coffee are divided into small portions and hidden in multiple locations throughout the house. In barn, the social dynamics of the community have evolved in response to the constant presence of uncertainty. Sunday gatherings at the Methodist Church have become exercises in collective diplomacy, where neighbors share information through carefully coded conversations and mutual support is offered through gestures so subtle they might be invisible. To outsiders, Mrs. Henderson has learned to recognize the slight nod that means soldiers passed through yesterday, the particular way of arranging hymn books that signals hide anything valuable, the specific tone of voice used when someone says lovely weather we're having but means danger approaching from the east. The children's games have evolved as well, becoming more sophisticated and more purposeful. Mary and her friends have developed elaborate scenarios where they practice hiding precious objects while appearing to play normal childhood games. They have become experts at creating concealment spaces in barns, root cellars, and even hollow trees, spaces that are invisible to casual observers but can accommodate everything from family jewelry to important documents. Their play has become a form of training, preparing them for scenarios that no child should need to contemplate but that have become part of the reality of their world. The relationship between the Henderson family and their animals has deepened in ways that reflect the practical necessities of uncertain times. Their cow, Bessie, has been trained to respond to whistle signals that can guide her to hidden areas of pasture when strangers approach. The chickens have been taught to roost in locations that are less visible from the road, and their rooster has been replaced with a quieter breed that won't announce the family's presence to every passing traveler. Even their old dog, Rex, has learned to distinguish between familiar footsteps and those of strangers, providing early warning through subtle changes in behavior rather than obvious barking. The weather itself has taken on new significance in their daily calculations. A sudden thunderstorm might provide cover for activities that require concealment, but it might also trap them in vulnerable positions if soldiers choose that moment to seek shelter. The changing seasons bring both opportunities and dangers. A tom fog can hide movement, but also prevents them from seeing approaching threats. Winter snow reveals tracks that might better remain hidden, but also makes travel more difficult for potential raiders. Communication with the outside world has become a carefully orchestrated dance of risk and necessity. Letters to and from relatives are written in language that appears innocuous but carries layers of coded meaning. A description of the weather might actually convey information about local military movements, while a recipe for preserving fruit might contain instructions for hiding valuables. Mrs. Henderson has become skilled at reading between the lines of letters from her sister in Baltimore. Understanding that the children are doing well in their studies might mean the Union forces are well supplied and disciplined, while little Johnny has been having trouble with his arithmetic, could indicate Confederate raids have been causing problems in the area. The local economy has adapted to wartime conditions in ways that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. Bartering has largely replaced cash transactions, not just because money is scarce, but because it leaves fewer records that might attract unwanted official attention. Mrs. Henderson might trade eggs for lamp oil or butter for needles and thread, exchanges that are negotiated through subtle conversations and completed through arrangements that appear casual but are actually carefully planned. The general store has become a kind of neutral territory where information is exchanged along with goods, but even their conversations are conducted in the careful language of people who understand that walls have ears and that today's friend might become tomorrow's informant under pressure. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance has become apparent in small ways that accumulate over time. Mr. Henderson's hands shake slightly when he reads letters, not from age, but from the stress of always expecting bad news. Mrs. Henderson has developed the habit of listening intently to every sound outside their house, her head tilting slightly at noises that would once have passed unnoticed. The children have learned to sleep lightly, to wake instantly at unusual sounds, and to remain perfectly still until they can identify whether approaching footsteps belong to family members or strangers. Yet, within this framework of constant caution, moments of surprising normalcy continue to emerge. Mrs. Henderson still tends her flower garden, though she has chosen varieties that are less conspicuous and require less obvious care. The family still gathers for evening prayers, though their requests have expanded to include safe passage for travelers, wisdom for leaders, and protection for all those caught in circumstances beyond their control. Thomas still whittles wooden toys for his little sister, though he now carves them small enough to be easily hidden and portable enough to be carried. If the family needs to leave quickly, the seasonal rhythms that once defined rural life continue, but they have been overlaid with new patterns of preparation and concealment. Apple harvest requires not just gathering the fruit, but processing it in ways that won't attract attention lest smoke from the drying fires. It's more care in disposing of waste that might signal abundance to passing observers. The slaughter of livestock for winter meat must be timed to coincide with periods when smoke won't be noticed and when the work can be completed quickly if interrupted. As winter approaches, the Henderson family begins the preparations that will determine whether they survive until spring. But these preparations must be balanced against, the possibility that they might need to abandon everything they've worked to preserve. It is this peculiar mathematics of survival planning for permanence while preparing for flight that has come to define the daily existence of families caught in the shifting boundaries of a nation at war with itself, where the simple act of living through another day requires the kind of courage that history books rarely acknowledge, but that forms the true foundation of human endurance. Winter's arrival transforms the Henderson farm and the surrounding countryside into a landscape that demands new forms of adaptation and survival. The bare branches of oak and maple trees now offer no concealment from movements across the fields, making every journey beyond the immediate vicinity of their house a calculated risk that must be weighed against necessity. The cold itself becomes both ally and enemy, preserves food naturally, and makes the tracks of strangers more visible in snow and frozen mud. But it also increases the family's vulnerability, as maintaining warmth requires fires that produce telltale smoke and demands fuel that might not be available when supply lines are disrupted by military activities. Mrs. Henderson has developed a winter routine that would seem obsessive to someone who has never lived with the constant possibility of sudden displacement. Each morning, she mentally inventories everything in their house according to a complex hierarchy of importance and portability. The family Bible and their legal documents are kept in a leather satchel that never leaves her immediate vicinity. The children's winter clothes are organized not just for warmth and accessibility, but so that they can be bundled quickly into packages that each family member can carry if they need to leave on foot. Even their food storage has been reorganized with mobility in mind, some preserved in ways that require permanent storage in the root cellar, with significant portions prepared in forms that can be transported in cloth bags or small wooden boxes. The isolation of winter months has intensified the family's reliance on each other in ways that create both intimacy and strain. Thomas has assumed responsibilities that would have belonged to hired hands in peacetime, not just in terms of physical labor, but in making decisions that could affect the family's survival. Barely 15, he now carries himself with the careful deliberation of someone who understands that his judgment might determine whether his younger sister has enough to eat next month. His childhood has not exactly ended, but it has been compressed and accelerated in ways that are both necessary and tragic. Young Mary has developed skills that speak to the remarkable adaptability of children facing circumstances beyond their control. She can now identify the sounds of different types of military equipment from considerable distances, the particular creak of artillery wheels, the distinctive rhythm of cavalry horses, the heavy tread of infantry columns. More remarkably, she has learned to gauge the mood and intentions of these various forces based on subtle details of their movement and behavior. A cavalry unit moving at a relaxed pace with loose formation suggests routine patrol, while the same unit in tight formation at higher speed might indicate pursuit or urgent mission. This knowledge, accumulated through careful observation and whispered conversations with adults, has become part of her daily awareness in ways that no K2-year-old should need to master. The winter social gatherings that once provided warmth and community during the darkest months have been transformed by the realities of wartime existence. The traditional cornhusking bees and quilting circles continue, but they now serve multiple purposes beyond their original social and practical functions. These gatherings have become opportunities for sharing critical information about safe routes of travel, reliable sources of supplies, and the movements of various military units. The women have developed a sophisticated system of communication that operates beneath the surface of apparently normal domestic conversation. Mrs. Henderson might mention, casually, that her sister's recipe for apple butter requires extra care. This year, information that the other women understand means that Union supply wagons have been passing through the area with unusual frequency, and that extra caution should be exercised when traveling the main roads. Similarly, a comment about needing to mend the fence posts before spring might actually convey intelligence about Confederate scouts having been seen in the vicinity. These coded conversations require constant mental agility and perfect memory, as the consequences of misunderstanding or forgetting crucial information could be measured in lives rather than mere inconvenience. The men's gatherings, often centered around repairs to farm equipment or the sharing of labor-intensive tasks, have evolved their own methods of information exchange. Mr. Henderson has learned to read volumes of meaning into casual discussions about weather patterns, crop yields, and the condition of local roads. A neighbor's mention that the South pasture has been giving trouble might actually indicate that Confederate forces have been requisitioning supplies in that area, while a comment about needing to check the north fence line could signal that Union patrols have increased their activity along specific routes. The economic relationships that sustain their community have become increasingly complex and fraught with risk. The traditional credit systems that allow farmers to purchase supplies in spring and pay after harvest have largely collapsed, replaced by immediate barter arrangements that require careful negotiation and assessment of relative value. Mrs. Henderson, I trade a dozen eggs for a pound of salt, but she must also consider whether the person making the trade can be trusted not to reveal that the Henderson family has chickens productive enough to spare eggs, information that could attract unwelcome attention from hungry soldiers or desperate neighbors. The children's education continues, but it has been fundamentally altered by their circumstances. Mary still learns to read and write, but her primers now include practical lessons in geography that focus on escape routes and safe havens rather than abstract knowledge about distant states and cities. Mathematics lessons involve calculations related to food rationing and resource management rather than theoretical problems about abstract quantities. Thomas studies history, but his lessons concentrate on military tactics and the geography of famous battles, knowledge that might prove essential if he needs to understand the strategic significance of troop movements in their area. Religious faith has provided both comfort and additional complexity during these difficult months. The Methodist Church continues to hold services, but the content of sermons requires careful consideration of the mixed loyalties within the congregation. Prayers are offered for all our brave boys, but specific requests for divine protection must be worded in ways that don't reveal which army a particular family supports. The familiar hymns and biblical passages that once provided simple comfort now carry layers of coded meaning, with certain verses taking on particular significance for families facing specific types of danger. The physical environment of their farm has been subtly modified in ways that reflect their adaptation to potential threats. New outbuildings have been constructed with multiple exits and concealed storage spaces. The barn now includes hidden compartments where valuable tools and small livestock can be concealed if necessary. Even the house itself has been altered, with certain floorboards loosened to provide quick access to hiding spaces, and window coverings arranged to allow observation of approaching visitors while maintaining the appearance of normal domestic activity. The seasonal tasks that defined farm life continue, but they have been overlaid with strategic considerations that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. The repair of fences and buildings must be balanced against the need to avoid appearing too prosperous or too defenseless. Maintaining their property in good condition suggests resources that might attract confiscation, while allowing it to appear to run down might indicate vulnerability that could invite predation. Finding the precise balance between these extremes requires constant vigilance and careful judgment. The preservation and preparation of food has become a science of concealment and contingency planning. Root vegetables are stored not just in the traditional root cellar, but in multiple hidden locations that can be accessed even if the main house becomes inaccessible. Preserved meats are prepared in portions that can feed the family for specific periods of time, allowing for precise rationing calculations based on various scenarios. Even their seed supply for next year's crops has been divided and hidden in different locations, ensuring that some portion would survive even if raiders discovered and destroyed their primary store's communication with extended family, and the outside world has developed its own elaborate protocols designed to protect both the senders and recipients of information. Letters are written in seemingly innocent language that requires shared knowledge to decode, and they are often divided into multiple parts sent through different routes to reduce the risk of interception. A letter, ostensibly about domestic concerns, might actually contain crucial intelligence about military movements, supply shortages, or safe routes of travel, but this information is embedded so subtly that it would be invisible to anyone not specifically trained to recognize the codes. The psychological resilience that has allowed the Henderson family to endure these months of uncertainty has been built through small daily practices that maintain their sense of identity and purpose. Mrs. Henderson continues to maintain certain domestic routines, not because they are necessary for survival, but because they provide continuity with their previous life and hope for their future recovery. She still sets the table with her good china for Sunday dinners, still insists that the children wash and dress properly for church, still tends to small, decorative details that serve no practical purpose but maintain their connection to a more civilized existence. As winter deepens and the possibility of spring seems increasingly distant, the Henderson family has achieved a kind of equilibrium with their challenging circumstances. They have learned to find moments of peace and even joy within the framework of constant vigilance. Thomas has discovered a talent for woodworking that allows him to create useful items while expressing artistic creativity. Mary has developed a remarkable memory for stories and songs, becoming the family's repository of cultural knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson have found that their marriage has been strengthened by the necessity of complete trust and cooperation. Their partnership deepened by shared challenges that have tested and proven their mutual commitment. Yet, beneath this adaptation and resilience runs the constant awareness that their situation could change without warning, that the careful balance they have achieved could be disrupted by events entirely beyond their control. They live with the knowledge that tomorrow might bring news that would require them to abandon everything they have worked to preserve, and that the skills they have developed for survival in one set of circumstances might prove inadequate for the new challenges that an evolving conflict could present. It is this combination of competent adaptation and underlying vulnerability that defines the experience of families caught in the uncertain territory between opposing forces, where the simple act of continuing to exist requires a form of heroism that goes largely unrecognized, but forms the true foundation upon which larger historical events unfold. As we move from the intimate world of the Henderson family to the corridors of power in Washington, imagine yourself walking through the White House in the early spring of 1865. The building itself bears the subtle marks of a nation that has been at war for 4 long years. The once pristine wallpaper shows the wear of constant activity. The carpets have been walked thin by endless streams of visitors, officials, and messengers, and the very air seems to carry the weight of momentous decisions made and unmade within these walls. The gaslight fixtures flicker with the rhythm of a city that never quite sleeps, where telegraph messages arrive at all hours, bringing news from distant battlefields, and where the president of a wounded nation works through the night in his office, bent over correspondence that will shape the future of American democracy. Abraham Lincoln sits at his desk in the private study adjacent to his bedroom. It's a tall figure made even more imposing by the shadows cast by the oil lamp that provides his working light in these late evening hours. The desk itself tells the story of his presidency papers, scattered in organized chaos, ink stains that mark countless urgent communications, and the deep scratches left by years of intensive use. His pen moves across the paper with the deliberate care of someone who understands that every word he writes might be preserved for posterity, yet also with the fluidity of a man who has spent his life crafting language to persuade, comfort, and inspire. The letter he writes tonight is unlike the grand proclamations and official communications that have defined his correspondence during these years of crisis. This is a private letter intended for someone whose identity history would never fully reveal, written in the hand of a man who senses that his time in this office, and perhaps his time on earth, may be drawing to a close. The words flow from a pen guided by exhaustion, wisdom, and a profound understanding of human nature that has been deepened by years of bearing responsibility for choices that determined the fate of millions. My dear friend, the letter begins, and already in these 3 simple words, we can hear the voice of Lincoln speaking not as president, but as a man who has learned to treasure the few relationships that provide genuine human connection amid the isolation of supreme power. The candlelight flickers across the page as he pauses, his mind perhaps wandering to the events of recent weeks, the fall of Richmond, Lee's retreat across Virginia, the growing certainty that the war which has consumed his presidency and transformed his nation is finally nearing its end. Lincoln's physical appearance in these final weeks of his life bears witness to the toll that leadership during Civil War has exacted. His face, already angular and distinctive, has been carved into even sharper relief by sleepless nights and the constant pressure of decisions that weigh upon him. His hands, large and capable, show the slight tremor that comes not from age, but from the accumulated stress of years spent navigating between the demands of military necessity and moral conviction. Yet his eyes, those deep-set eyes that photographers and artists have tried to capture, retained the spark of intellectual curiosity and human compassion that has sustained him through the darkest periods of the conflict. The White House staff moves quietly through the building around him, their footsteps muffled by carpets and their voices kept low out of respect for the president's need for concentration. Mrs. Lincoln Mary has retired for the evening, but her presence in the building seems to provide him with an anchor of domestic normalcy that balances the weight of public responsibility. Their relationship, tested by personal tragedy and public scrutiny, has evolved during these war years into something that transcends simple marriage. They have become partners in bearing burdens that no previous first family had ever been asked to shoulder. The letter continues with reflections that reveal the private thoughts of a man who's been forced to make decisions that would have been unthinkable to previous generations of American leaders. The weight of this office, he writes, is not found in the documents that cross my desk or the meetings that fill my days, but in the quiet moments when I consider the full meaning of the choices we have made. His handwriting, usually so controlled and precise, shows slight variations that suggest the emotional undercurrents beneath his carefully composed public persona. Lincoln's study, dimly lit and filled with the accumulated papers of his presidency, has become a sanctuary where he can drop the public mask that he wears during daylight hours. Here, surrounded by books that have shaped his thinking and letters from ordinary citizens who have shared their hopes and fears with their president, he can allow himself to feel the full emotional weight of his position atop. The walls are lined with maps that show the progress of Union armies across the South, but also with personal items that remind him of his life before the presidency, photographs of his children, including the beloved Willie, who died in this very building, and volumes of poetry and philosophy that have provided solace during the darkest nights of the war. The composition of this letter unfolds slowly, each sentence carefully crafted not just for clarity, but for emotional honesty. Lincoln writes of his hopes for the reconstruction that must follow military victory, but his words reveal a man who understands that the end of armed conflict will bring new challenges that may prove even more difficult than the war itself. The peace that follows the struggle, he continues, must be built on foundations stronger than military victory alone. We must find ways to bind up the nation's wounds while ensuring that the principles for which so many have died are preserved and strengthened. The sound of distant hoofbeats on the cobblestones outside occasionally interrupts his concentration, reminding him that even in these late hours, the business of war continues. Couriers arrive with dispatches from the field. Telegraph operators maintain their vigilant watch for news from Grant's army. Security personnel patrol the grounds with the heightened awareness that comes from protecting a leader whose life has been threatened countless times. Yet Lincoln has learned to work within this atmosphere of controlled tension, finding pockets of peace and reflection even amid the constant demands of crisis management. His writing reveals a man grappling with the moral complexities that have defined his presidency. The Emancipation Proclamation, the suspension of habeas corpus, the prosecution of a war that has cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Each of these decisions has required him to balance competing moral claims in ways that have left permanent marks on his conscience. History will judge whether we chose correctly, he writes, but I pray that those who come after us will understand that we acted from conviction rather than convenience, and that our choices, however imperfect, were guided by a vision of what this nation might become rather than mere preservation of what it had been. The letter touches on personal matters as well, revealing glimpses of the private man beneath the public figure. He writes of his concern for Mary's emotional well-being, her struggle to cope with the pressures of public life and the grief that has shadowed their family since Willie's death. He reflects on his surviving son, Robert, who has managed to serve in the Union Army while maintaining his studies at Harvard, and on Tad, whose youthful energy provides moments of joy and normalcy in the somber atmosphere of wartime Washington. Lincoln's relationship with his cabinet and military leaders emerges in subtle references throughout the letter. His respect for Grant's steady competence, his complex feelings about McClellan's earlier failures, his appreciation for Stanton's administrative efficiency despite their occasional disagreements. All of these professional relationships are touched with the understanding that leadership during crisis creates bonds that transcend normal political associations. These men have shared the burden of decisions that will echo through American history, and that shared responsibility has created a form of camaraderie that exists alongside their official roles. The physical act of writing seems to provide Lincoln with a form of meditation, a way of processing the events and emotions that daylight hours allow no time to contemplate. His pen moves steadily across the paper, occasionally pausing as he searches for exactly the right word or phrase to capture a complex thought. The letter becomes a vehicle for self-examination, a way of taking inventory of his presidency and his life as he senses that both may be approaching their conclusion. Religious themes weave through the letter, reflecting Lincoln's complex relationship with faith and providence, while never formally joining a church. He has developed during these war years a profound sense of divine purpose and human vocation that infuses his thinking about the conflict and its meaning. We have been instruments in hands greater than our own, he writes. And while we cannot claim to understand fully the purposes for which this nation has been tested, we can trust that the suffering has not been meaningless and that justice, however delayed, will ultimately prevail. The letter's tone shifts as Lincoln considers the immediate challenges that lie ahead. The surrender of Lee's army, which now seems inevitable, will mark the end of organized Confederate resistance. But Lincoln understands that military victory will be only the beginning of a longer struggle to reunite the nation. His thoughts turn to the practical questions of Reconstruction, how to reintegrate the Southern states, how to protect the rights of freed slaves, how to heal the wounds of a conflict that has divided families and communities across the country. The clock in Lincoln's study chimes softly, marking another hour past midnight. And still the president continues his careful composition, each word weighed not just for its immediate meaning, but for its place in the larger conversation he is attempting to have with posterity. The letter has become more than simple correspondence. It has evolved into a form of confession, meditation, and legacy document that reveals the inner workings of a mind that has been shaped by responsibility. Unlike any previous American leader has been asked to bear the shadows cast by his oil, lamps seem to dance across the page as he writes, creating an atmosphere of intimate reflection that contrasts sharply with the public ceremonies and formal speeches that have defined so much of his presidency. I find myself thinking often of the young men who will not return to their families. Lincoln continues, his pen moving with deliberate slowness as he contemplates the human cost of the decisions he has made. Each casualty report that crosses my desk represents not merely numbers for military planners to consider, but sons, fathers, brothers whose absence will be felt in countless homes across our nation for generations to come. The weight of their sacrifice is not lessened by the righteousness of our cause, nor can the necessity of our choices diminish the reality of the grief that follows in the wake of every battle. These words, written in the privacy of his study, revealed the profound personal burden that Lincoln has carried throughout the war, the knowledge that his decisions as commander-in-chief have directly resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans. The president pauses in his writing, his gaze turning toward the window that overlooks the Potomac River. Though the darkness beyond reveals little more than the occasional glimmer of lantern light from boats moving along the water, this view has become familiar to him during these long nights of contemplation, when sleep eludes him and he finds solace only in the act of setting down his thoughts on paper. The river below has served throughout the war as a highway for supplies and troops moving toward the various theaters of conflict. And Lincoln has often stood at this window watching the constant flow of military traffic that speaks to the enormous logistical effort required to sustain armies in the field. His thoughts turn to the specific individuals who have shaped his understanding of the conflict and its human dimensions. He writes of conversations with wounded soldiers in the hospitals that have filled Washington. Young men whose physical injuries are often less significant than the invisible wounds they carry from witnessing the destruction of their comrades and the collapse of their previous understanding of human nature. These visits, which Lincoln has made quietly and without fanfare, have provided him with insights into the war's impact that no official report could convey. The courage he has witnessed in these hospital wardsmen facing amputation with stoic determination, soldiers whose sight has been destroyed but who speak hopefully of their future contributions to society. boys barely old enough to shave, who have learned to cope with memories that would challenge much older minds, has both inspired and humbled him. The letter reveals Lincoln's complex relationship with the concept of divine providence, a theme that has become increasingly central to his thinking as the war has progressed. "I cannot claim to understand the purposes of the Almighty," he writes, "but I have come to believe that this nation has been placed in the crucible of civil war, not as punishment for our sins, though we have surely sinned, but as preparation for responsibilities that we cannot yet imagine. The union that emerges from this conflict will be tested in ways that will require the strength that can only be forged through suffering, and the wisdom that comes only through the humbling experience of discovering the limits of human understanding." These theological reflections are interwoven with practical considerations about the immediate challenges facing the nation. Lincoln's thoughts on Reconstruction reveal a man who understands that the end of military hostilities will require a delicate balance between justice for the freed slaves and practical necessities of reunification. His correspondence with various political leaders has revealed the deep divisions within his own party about how aggressively to pursue punishment of Confederate leaders and how completely to restructure Southern society. The letter hints at his frustration with radical Republicans who seem more interested in revenge than reconciliation, as well as his concern about Democrats who appear willing to compromise away the gains that have been purchased with so much blood. The personal cost of his presidency emerges in subtle references throughout this portion of the letter. Lincoln writes of the changes in his relationship with Mary, acknowledging that the pressures of public life and the grief of losing Willie have created strains that have required constant attention and patience to overcome. Their marriage, once characterized by passionate intellectual engagement and shared political ambitions, has evolved into something more complex, a partnership in bearing public burdens while maintaining private spaces for mutual support and understanding. Mary struggles with depression and anxiety, exacerbated by the hostile press coverage she has endured, and the social pressures of wartime Washington have required Lincoln to develop reserves of emotional strength that complement his more visible political and military leadership. The physical deterioration that Lincoln has experienced during his presidency becomes apparent in small details throughout the letter. His handwriting, usually so controlled and precise, shows occasional signs of the tremor that has developed in his hands from stress and exhaustion. He mentions the headaches that have become a constant companion, the digestive problems that have made eating a chore rather than a pleasure, and the persistent fatigue that no amount of rest seems to cure. Yet these physical symptoms are mentioned not as complaints, but as simple acknowledgments of the toll that supreme responsibility exacts on the human frame. Lincoln's reflections on his pre-presidential life reveal a man who has been fundamentally transformed by the experience of leading a nation through civil war. The prairie lawyer who once focused his attention on local disputes and state politics has been forced to grapple with questions of national destiny and international significance that have expanded his understanding of both American democracy and human nature. The man who entered this office 4 years ago, he writes, could not have imagined the choices that would be required of him, nor could he have anticipated the ways in which those choices would reshape not only the nation, but his own understanding of justice, mercy, the proper relationship between individual conscience and public necessity. The letter touches on Lincoln's relationship with his generals, revealing the evolution of his understanding of military leadership and strategy. His early frustrations with McClellan's cautious approach have given way to appreciation for Grant's willingness to accept the heavy casualties necessary to achieve decisive results. Yet, Lincoln acknowledges the moral complexity of this appreciation, recognizing that his satisfaction with Grant's aggressiveness is balanced by awareness of the human cost of such tactics. The president has learned to read casualty reports with a dual perspective of a military commander who must assess strategic effectiveness and a human being who must confront the reality of individual suffering. His thoughts return to the question of his own legacy, a subject that he approaches with characteristic humility and self-awareness. History will render its judgment on the choices we have made, he writes, and I suspect that judgment will be influenced more by results than by intentions. This union emerges from our current trials stronger and more committed to the principles of human equality. Dan, our sacrifices will be justified regardless of the criticism that may be directed toward specific decisions. If, however, we fail to use this opportunity to create a more perfect union, then the suffering we have endured will stand as testimony to our failure of imagination and will. The international dimensions of the Civil War receive attention in the letter, reflecting Lincoln's awareness that the conflict has implications extending far beyond American borders. European observers have watched the war with intense interest, some hoping for American failure that would validate their skepticism about democratic government, others seeing in Union victory the possibility of expanded freedom and human rights. Lincoln writes of his correspondence with working-class groups in Britain who have supported the Union cause, despite the economic hardships caused by the cotton embargo, and of his awareness that the outcome of the American experiment will influence democratic movements throughout the world. Religious and philosophical themes continue to weave through the letter. But Lincoln's treatment of these subjects reveals a man who has moved beyond simple piety to a more complex understanding of the relationship between human action and divine purpose. He no longer claims to know God's will with the certainty that characterized some of his earlier speeches, but neither has he abandoned his belief that the war serves purposes larger than the immediate political and military objectives of either side. We are instruments in hands greater than our own, he reiterates, but we remain responsible for ensuring that our service is worthy of the cause we have been called to defend, the letter reveals. Lincoln's thoughts about specific policy decisions that will shape Reconstruction, though he approaches these subjects with the caution of someone who understands that circumstances may require modifications of even the best-laid plans. His ideas about suffrage for freed slaves reflect both moral conviction and political pragmatism. He believes deeply in the principle of political equality, but he also recognizes the practical challenges of implementing such changes in a society that has been structured around racial hierarchy for generations. His correspondence with the military commanders in occupied southern territories has provided him with detailed reports about the attitudes and capabilities of both white and black populations, information that will be crucial in designing policies that are both just and sustainable. The emotional toll of presidential decision-making emerges in Lincoln's reflection on specific moments when he has been forced to choose between competing moral claims: the suspension of habeas corpus, the use of military tribunals for civilian defendants, the authorization of tactics that have resulted in significant civilian suffering. Each of these decisions has required him to balance immediate military necessity against long-term constitutional principles. The preservation of democracy, he writes, sometimes requires the temporary limitation of democratic freedoms. But the danger lies in allowing temporary expedients to become permanent features of government. A test of our republican institutions will come not in their ability to function during times of crisis, but in their capacity to resume normal operations when the crisis has passed. As the candle burns lower in Lincoln's study, it's casting longer shadows across the papers scattered on his desk, the president's letter takes on an increasingly personal and prophetic tone. The late hour seems to have stripped away the last vestiges of his public persona, leaving only the private man grappling with thoughts and fears that he has shared with no one during the daylight hours of his presidency. His pen moves more slowly now, each word chosen with the deliberation of someone who senses that this correspondence may serve as a final accounting of his thoughts and hopes for the nation he has led through its greatest trial. I find myself haunted by dreams, Lincoln writes, It's usually controlled handwriting showing slight variations that speak to the emotional undercurrents of this admission. Not the nightmares one might expect of a man who has presided over so much bloodshed, but strange visions of what this nation might become if we prove worthy of the sacrifices that have been made on our behalf. I see cities where children of all races learn together in schools that would be unimaginable today. Farmlands worked by free men who own the soil they cultivate, and assemblies where representatives chosen by all citizens debate the great questions of their time without the shadow of human bondage darkening their deliberations. These visionary passages reveal a Lincoln whose understanding of the war's meaning extends far beyond the immediate questions of Union and slavery that have dominated public discourse. His correspondence with educators, religious leaders, social reformers has exposed him to ideas about human potential and social progress that have fundamentally altered his conception of what American democracy might achieve. The letter hints at conversations with Frederick Douglass, whose visits to the White House have provided Lincoln with perspectives on freedom and equality that have challenged and expanded his own thinking about racial justice and human dignity. The president's reflection on his relationship with Congress reveals the evolution of his understanding of executive power and democratic governance. The tensions with radical Republicans who have criticized his moderate approach to Reconstruction. The challenges of maintaining support from war Democrats who question his expansion of federal authority, and a constant balancing act required to maintain political coalitions capable of sustaining the war effort have taught him lessons about leadership that no amount of prior political experience could have provided. The art of democratic leadership, he observes, lies not in commanding obedience, but in building consensus around principles that transcend immediate partisan interests. The president who attempts to govern through force alone will discover that democratic institutions possess their own forms of resistance that make tyranny ultimately self-defeating. Lincoln's thoughts turn to the specific individuals who have shaped his presidency in ways that history may never fully record. He writes with particular warmth about John Hay and John Nicolay, his private secretaries whose loyalty and competence have provided him with a buffer against the countless demands and interruptions that would otherwise make sustained thought impossible. Their discretion in managing his schedule, their skill in drafting routine correspondence, and their ability to serve as informal channels of communication with various political factions have been essential to his ability to function effectively as president during the crisis. The letter reveals Lincoln's awareness of the hatred that his policies have generated among certain segments of the population, and his understanding that this animosity may translate into personal danger that extends beyond the normal political opposition faced by any president. His correspondence with Allan Pinkerton and other security officials has made him acutely aware of the various threats against his life. But the letter suggests that he has made a conscious decision not to allow fear of assassination to influence his policy decisions or limit his public appearances. A president who governs from behind walls of protection may preserve his physical safety, he writes, but he forfeits the connection with the people that provides democratic leadership with its moral authority. The international dimensions of the war continue to occupy Lincoln's thoughts, particularly the potential for European intervention that could fundamentally alter the conflict's outcome. His correspondence with Charles Francis Adams in London and other diplomatic representatives has provided him with detailed intelligence about European attitudes toward the war. And he understands that Union victory is not inevitable, but depends partly on maintaining international neutrality through careful diplomacy and successful military campaigns. The letter touches on his satisfaction with the Trent Affair's resolution and his concern about ongoing Confederate efforts to secure European recognition and support. Lincoln's reflection on specific military campaigns reveals his evolution from a politician with limited military knowledge to a commander-in-chief with sophisticated understanding of strategy and logistics. His analysis of the Peninsula Campaign's failures, the missed opportunities after Antietam, and the lessons learned from Gettysburg show a man who has educated himself in military science through the painful process of trial and error. War is the most terrible of teachers, he observes, but it provides lessons about human nature and organizational effectiveness that cannot be learned through peaceful study alone. The letter addresses Lincoln's relationship with his cabinet in terms that reveal both appreciation for their varied talents and frustration with their occasional inability to subordinate personal ambitions to larger national objectives. His complex feelings about Edwin Stanton emerge clearly. Respect for the War Secretary's administrative capabilities, coupled with exasperation at his tendency toward harsh judgments and inflexible positions. Similarly, his thoughts about William Seward reflect gratitude for the Secretary of State's diplomatic skills, balanced by awareness of Seward's occasional overestimation of his own influence and importance. Religious themes continue to permeate the letter, but Lincoln's treatment of these subjects has moved beyond conventional piety to embrace a more complex understanding of divine purpose and human responsibility. His references to prayer reveal a man who has learned to seek guidance without expecting simple answers, who has come to see his role as president not as the implementation of divine will, but as faithful service in circumstances where complete understanding is impossible. We walk by faith rather than sight, he writes, not because we lack the intelligence to comprehend our situation, but because the purposes we serve extend beyond our capacity for complete comprehension. The practical challenges of post-war reconstruction occupy an increasing portion of the letter as Lincoln contemplates the transition from military victory to lasting peace. His thoughts on the establishment of new state governments in the conquered South reveal a man searching for policies that will satisfy the demands of justice without creating conditions for renewed conflict. The tension between punishment and reconciliation, between protecting the rights of freed slaves and maintaining the support of white Unionists, between federal authority and state autonomy, these competing pressures have forced Lincoln to develop approaches to governance that have no clear precedents in American history. Lincoln's personal relationships within his family receive careful attention in this portion of the letter, revealing the private cost of public service during national crisis. His concern for Robert, service in the Union Army, has exposed him to the same dangers faced by thousands of other young men, but under the additional burden of being the president's son speaks to the particular challenges faced by political families during wartime. His references to Tad show a father's love tempered by awareness that his youngest son is growing up in circumstances that no child should have to experience, surrounded by security concerns, subjected to public scrutiny, and living in a house where the business of war intrudes into every aspect of daily life. The letter touches on Lincoln's relationship with the press and his understanding of how public opinion influences democratic governance during crisis. His complex feelings about newspaper coverage appreciation for editors who have supported the war effort, balanced by frustration with those who have prioritized partisan advantage over national unity, reveal a politician who has learned to work within the constraints of free speech while recognizing its potential to complicate effective leadership. A democratic people must be trusted with the truth about their government's policies. He writes, even when that truth may be used by opponents to undermine necessary measures. Lincoln's thoughts on the economic transformation that the war has accelerated show his awareness that military victory will leave the nation fundamentally changed in ways that extend far beyond the abolition of slavery. The growth of federal authority, the expansion of industrial capacity, the development of new financial institutions, and the creation of a continental transportation network have reshaped American society in ways that will influence the country's development for generations. His correspondence with business leaders and economists has provided him with insights into these changes that inform his thinking about post-war policy and national development. The letter reveals Lincoln's understanding of his own mortality in terms that are both matter-of-fact and deeply moving. He writes, not with morbid preoccupation, but with the calm acceptance of someone who has lived with danger for so long that the possibility of death has become simply another factor to consider. In planning and decision-making, every president must govern with the awareness that his time in office is limited. He observes, but circumstances have required me to consider that my time on earth may be even more constrained than the normal term of democratic service. As dawn begins to lighten the sky beyond his study window, Lincoln brings his letter to a close with reflections that combine personal humility with profound hope for the nation's future. His final paragraphs speak to themes of redemption and renewal that have sustained him through the darkest periods of the war. But they also acknowledge the possibility that the work he has begun may need to be completed by others. The preservation of this union and the advancement of human freedom are causes larger than any individual life. He concludes, and if my service to these principles should be cut short, I trust that others will emerge to continue the work we have begun. The letter's final lines are written as the first light of dawn touches the papers on his desk, creating a symbolic transition from the darkness of war toward the possibility of peace and renewal. Lincoln signs his name with the same careful precision that has characterized the entire correspondence, then folds the pages and places them in an envelope that he addresses in his own hand. The identity of the intended recipient remains unclear, perhaps a trusted friend, perhaps a member of his family, perhaps simply posterity itself, but the content of this final letter stands as testament to the private thoughts and deepest convictions of a man who led his nation through its greatest trial, while maintaining his essential humanity and his faith in the democratic experiment that he served until his death just days later. The silence that settles over Lincoln's study as he completes this correspondence speaks to the profound solitude that has been the constant companion of his presidency, but also to the peace that comes from having sat down and writing the thoughts and hopes that have sustained him through 4 years of unprecedented challenge. History will remember him for his public words and actions, but this private letter reveals the inner landscape of a mind that remained curious, compassionate, committed to principles larger than personal survival, even in the face of mortal danger and crushing responsibility. As we transition from the corridors of power to the quiet spaces where ordinary courage shaped extraordinary change, imagine yourself in a modest cabin in southeastern Pennsylvania on a cool autumn evening in 1858. The year is still 3 away from the outbreak of open warfare, but already the tensions that will tear the nation apart are creating networks of resistance and hope that operate in the shadows. Guided by signals as subtle as the patterns stitched into household quilts, the flickering light of oil lamps illuminates the careful work of women whose needles carry messages that could mean the difference between freedom and recapture, between life and death for human beings seeking to escape the bonds of slavery. Sarah McKinnon sits by her kitchen table, her weathered hands moving with practiced precision as she guides her needle through fabric that, to a casual observer, would appear to be simply another example of the domestic craftsmanship that fills American homes. But the pattern emerging under her careful stitches carries meanings that extend far beyond decoration or warmth. The geometric shapes she creates: flying geese pointing northward, log cabin blocks with yellow centers, bear's paw patterns that suggest the rough terrain of mountain passages, form a vocabulary of hope and direction that speaks to those who have learned to read the language of liberation stitched into cotton and wool. The quilting tradition that provides cover for this clandestine communication system has deep roots in both African and European textile practices, creating a form of cultural fusion that perfectly suits its underground purpose. Sarah has learned her patterns from her mother, who in turn inherited them from generations of women who understood that domestic skills could serve purposes far beyond household needs. The techniques she employs: the careful selection of colors, the precise arrangement of geometric elements, the strategic use of contrasting fabrics, reflect knowledge that has been passed down through informal networks of women who trusted each other with secrets that could cost lives if revealed to the wrong people. The physical environment of Sarah's home reflects the dual nature of her existence as both ordinary homemaker and active participant in the Underground Railroad. Her kitchen, the center of her domestic life, doubles as a workspace where coded messages are created and interpreted. The large wooden table where she prepares meals for her family also serves as a quilting frame, where patterns are planned and executed with the precision of military strategy. The pantry, where she stores preserves and staples, includes hidden compartments where supplies for fugitive slaves are maintained. Textile clothing, medical supplies, small amounts of money that can mean the difference between successful escape and tragic recapture. Sarah's husband, Thomas, works their small farm with the knowledge that their property serves as a way station on one of the most dangerous and important routes to freedom in antebellum America. The barn where they store hay and house their livestock includes carefully concealed spaces where human beings seeking freedom can rest during daylight hours before continuing their perilous journey northward. The root cellar beneath their kitchen floor has been modified to provide temporary shelter that can accommodate several people while remaining invisible to casual observers or even determined searchers who lack specific knowledge of its construction. The community in which the McKinnons live maintains a delicate balance between open opposition to slavery and the practical necessities of clandestine operations. The local Methodist church, where Sarah and Thomas worship each Sunday, includes members who share their commitment to human freedom, but also others whose loyalties remain uncertain. The weekly quilting circles that bring together women from throughout the area serve multiple purposes. They provide opportunities for sharing domestic skills and maintaining social connections, but they also create venues for exchanging information about safe routes, dangerous areas, and the movements of slave catchers who patrol the region, seeking fugitives to return to bondage. The coded language that permeates these quilting gatherings requires constant mental agility and perfect memory from participants. A casual comment about completing the wedding ring pattern before winter and actually convey intelligence about the timing of a planned escape attempt, while a discussion of running out of red thread could signal that particular routes have become too dangerous for immediate use. The women who participate in these conversations must maintain perfect composure while discussing matters of life and death in terms that appear to focus on nothing more significant than household decoration and domestic planning. Sarah's quilting supplies themselves tell the story of a network that extends far beyond her immediate community. The fabrics she uses come from sources throughout the Northeast and Midwest, often carrying their own hidden messages about conditions in distant areas. A bolt of blue cotton from Ohio might indicate that routes through that state remain secure, while the absence of certain types of material could signal that specific areas have become too dangerous for Underground Railroad activities. The trading networks that supply these materials operate with the same careful discretion that characterizes all aspects of the freedom system, creating economic relationships that support liberation while maintaining the appearance of normal commercial activity. The actual process of creating quilts that carry coded messages requires skills that extend far beyond traditional needlework. Sarah must be able to create patterns that appear conventional to casual observers while embedding information that will be immediately apparent to those who possess the necessary knowledge to decode them. The challenge lies in achieving this dual purpose without creating designs that appear unusual enough to attract unwanted attention. A quilt that is too obviously symbolic might raise suspicions, while one that is too subtle might fail to convey its intended message to those who need to receive it. The seasonal rhythms that govern farm life provide natural cover for underground railroad activities, as the increased travel and activity associated with harvest time create opportunities for moving people without attracting notice. Sarah times her quilting projects to coincide with these periods of heightened activity, hanging finished quilts on her clothesline during times when their coded messages will be most useful to fugitives traveling through the area. The agricultural calendar becomes a form of operational planning that coordinates the movement of people seeking freedom with the natural patterns of rural life. The relationship between the McKinnon family and their neighbors requires constant navigation of competing loyalties and uncertain allegiances. While they can count on support from several families who shared their commitment to abolition, they must also be cautious around others whose positions remain unclear or who might be sympathetic to slavery for economic or political reasons. The social fabric of their community includes people whose opposition to the Underground Railroad could prove deadly to fugitive slaves and dangerous to those who assist them. Sarah's children have grown up understanding that their family's activities require absolute discretion and complete reliability. Her eldest daughter, Rebecca, now 16, has learned to create simple quilt patterns that can convey basic directional information, while her youngest son, barely 10 years old, has been taught to recognize the signs that indicate when strangers in their area might be slave catchers rather than legitimate travelers. The children's education includes lessons in reading human behavior and assessing potential threats that no childhood should require. But their parents understand that their safety and the success of their mission depend on everyone in the family maintaining appropriate vigilance. The medical knowledge that Sarah has acquired through years of caring for her family has proven invaluable in treating fugitive slaves to arrive at their station, suffering from the physical toll of traveling long distances on foot, often with inadequate food and clothing. Her medicine chest includes supplies specifically chosen for treating the types of injuries and illnesses most commonly encountered among people making desperate journeys to freedom herbs for treating infected wounds, medicines for reducing fever, and remedies for the digestive problems that result from irregular eating and age-act. Contaminated water sources. The financial costs of Underground Railroad participation create ongoing challenges that the McKinnon family has learned to manage through careful planning and community cooperation. The expense of feeding unexpected guests, providing clothing and supplies for travelers, and maintaining the modifications to their property that enable them to shelter fugitives represents a significant drain on their modest farm income. They have developed relationships with sympathetic merchants who provide supplies at reduced costs and with other Underground Railroad participants who share these financial burdens through informal networks of mutual support. Communication with other stations along the Underground Railroad requires sophisticated systems that can convey complex information while maintaining security against interception or betrayal. Sarah's quilts serve as one element in this communication network, but they are supplemented by other methods, including coded letters, symbolic arrangements of objects in windows or yards, and verbal messages passed through trusted intermediaries. The integration of these various communication methods creates redundancy that ensures important information reaches its intended recipients, even if individual channels are compromised. The emotional toll of Underground Railroad participation affects every member of the McKinnon family in ways that are rarely discussed openly, but that influence their daily interactions and long-term planning. The stress of maintaining dangerous secrets, the fear of discovery and prosecution, and the heartbreak of witnessing human suffering that they cannot always alleviate create psychological burdens that must be balanced against their moral commitment to the cause of freedom. Sarah has learned to find strength in a religious faith and in the knowledge that their work serves purposes larger than their own immediate interests. But she also understands that this calling requires sacrifices that will affect her family for years to come. The technical aspects of quilt making that enable the creation of coded Messages reflect sophisticated understanding of visual communication and symbolic representation. Sarah must consider not only the obvious elements of pattern and color, but also subtle details of construction technique, fabric selection, and finishing methods that can convey additional layers of meaning to those trained to recognize them. The binding technique used to finish a quilt's edges might indicate the urgency of a particular message, while the choice of batting material could suggest the season, when certain routes will be most safe for travel. The preservation of these coded quilts presents challenges that reflect the underground nature of the entire system. Quilts that carry messages too dangerous to be permanently displayed must be carefully stored in locations where they will remain accessible when needed, but invisible to those who might report their existence to authorities. Sarah has developed techniques for preserving these textiles that balance their practical utility as communication tools against the need to maintain them as ordinary household items that will not attract unwanted attention. As winter settles over the Pennsylvania countryside, the Underground Railroad's operations adapt to the challenges and opportunities presented by the changing season. Sarah McKinnon's quilting work takes on new urgency as the shorter days and longer nights provide extended periods of darkness that can shelter the movement of fugitive slaves, but also create conditions that make travel more dangerous and detection more likely. The patterns she stitches during these long winter evenings carry messages about seasonal routes, temporary shelters, and the specific challenges that travelers will face as they navigate through snow-covered terrain toward freedom. The log cabin quilt pattern that Sarah works on during these December nights serves multiple symbolic and practical purposes within the Underground Railroad's communication system. The traditional design, featuring a small central square surrounded by strips of fabric arranged to suggest the walls of a frontier dwelling, can be modified in subtle ways to convey specific information about safe houses and dangerous areas. A yellow center square indicates a safe station where fugitives can find shelter and assistance, while a black center warns of areas where slave catchers are known to be active. The arrangement of light and dark strips around the central square can provide directional information, with a placement of colors indicating the safest routes of approach and departure from particular locations. The community of women who gather for winter quilting sessions has evolved into something far more significant than a simple social club or a craft circle. These weekly meetings, held in rotation at different homes throughout the area, serve as intelligence briefings where information about Underground Railroad operations is shared through carefully coded conversations and symbolic needlework. The women who participate in these gatherings represent a cross-section of local society farmers' wives, shopkeepers, spouses, keepers, living on small pensions, but they are united by their commitment to human freedom and their willingness to risk legal punishment and social ostracism to assist those seeking to escape slavery. Mrs. Elizabeth Harrow, whose husband operates the local general store, brings to these gatherings information gleaned from travelers who stop to purchase supplies and from letters received from suppliers in distant cities. Her position at the center of local commerce provides her with intelligence about the movements of both legitimate travelers and those who might be pursuing fugitive slaves. She has learned to read the subtle signs that distinguish genuine merchants and farmers from bounty hunters and slave catchers, differences in dress, speech patterns, the types of questions they ask, and their apparent familiarity with the merchandise they claim to need. The actual process of encoding information into quilt patterns requires a sophisticated understanding of symbolic representation that has been developed through years of careful experimentation and refinement. The women have created a vocabulary of geometric shapes and color combinations that can convey complex information about travel conditions, safe houses, dangerous areas, and timing of movements. A flying geese pattern with triangles pointing north indicates safe passage in that direction, while the same pattern with triangles pointing south warns of dangers that require travelers to seek alternative routes. The size and arrangement of individual pattern elements can indicate distances, while the choice of fabrics can suggest the types of assistance available at particular locations. Sarah's daughter, Rebecca, has demonstrated a remarkable aptitude for this coded quilting. It's her 16-year-old mind proving adept at the complex mental calculations required to translate practical information into symbolic patterns and back again. Her youth provides perfect cover for her activities, as few observers would suspect a teenage girl of participating in illegal activities related to slavery resistance. Becca has learned to create simple patterns that can guide travelers from one safe house to the next. And she has developed her own innovations in the coding system that allow for more precise communication about timing and specific routes. The winter months also bring increased danger from professional slave catchers who use the clearer tracks left in snow to pursue fugitives more effectively than would be possible during other seasons. Sarah and her fellow conductors must adjust their methods accordingly, developing new techniques for concealing the passage of travelers and for providing assistance that will not leave evidence that could be used to track either the fugitives or their helpers. The quilts displayed during winter months must convey warnings about these seasonal dangers while also providing information about shelters and routes that can offer protection from both the weather and human pursuers. The financial network that supports Underground Railroad operations becomes particularly important during winter months when the costs of providing food, clothing, and shelter increase significantly. Sarah participates in an informal system of mutual aid that extends throughout the anti-slavery community, with families contributing what they can afford to support the common effort. Some provide money, others donate clothing or food, still others offer services such as medical care or transportation. The quilting circles serve as venues for coordinating these contributions, with conversations about fabric donations and pattern sharing serving as cover for discussions about more substantial forms of material support. The relationship between the Underground Railroad and the formal anti-slavery movement creates both opportunities and complications for participants like the McKinnon family. While they share common goals with prominent abolitionists and anti-slavery politicians, the illegal nature of their activities requires them to maintain careful distance from public advocacy that might attract official attention to their clandestine operations. Sarah corresponds with several women involved in organized anti-slavery societies, but these letters must be carefully crafted to avoid explicit references to Underground Railroad activities while still maintaining the connections that provide moral support and practical assistance. The children's role in Underground Railroad operations expands during winter months when their help becomes essential for maintaining the increased security measures that cold weather operations require. Young Timothy McKinnon, now 11 years old, has learned to recognize the difference between the footprints of family members and neighbors and those of strangers who might pose threats to their security. His sister Mary, just 8 years old, has been taught to play games that actually serve as security protocols. Her innocent-seeming activities in the yard provide cover for observing approaching visitors and assessing their intentions before they reach the house. The medical challenges associated with treating fugitive slaves become more complex during winter months when exposure, frostbite, and respiratory ailments add to the injuries and illnesses that result from long journeys undertaken with inadequate resources. Sarah has expanded her knowledge of herbal remedies and basic medical care to address these seasonal health problems, consulting with sympathetic doctors who provide advice while maintaining plausible deniability about the ultimate purpose of testimonies. Her medical education. Her medicine chest now includes supplies specifically chosen for treating cold weather injuries and for helping travelers regain sufficient strength to continue their journeys. The communication systems that link Underground Railroad stations across the region must adapt to winter conditions that can interrupt normal travel and mail delivery. Sarah and her fellow conductors have developed backup methods for sharing critical information when primary communication channels become unreliable due to weather or increased surveillance. These alternative systems include the use of trusted children as messengers, strategic placement of coded symbols in public locations, and the coordination of activities through seemingly normal commercial transactions that can continue even when other forms of communication are restricted. The psychological strain of maintaining Underground Railroad operations during winter months affects every aspect of the McKinnon family's daily life. The increased time spent indoors due to weather means that family members must be constantly vigilant about their conversations and behaviors, as any slip in security protocols could endanger not only their own safety, but the lives of fugitive slaves who depend on their assistance. The stress of maintaining perfect discretion while living in close quarters creates tensions that must be carefully managed through mutual support and shared commitment to their mission. The seasonal patterns of fugitive slave movements create specific challenges for conductors who must be prepared to provide assistance according to schedules they cannot completely control. Winter travel is generally less common due to the increased dangers and hardships, but when fugitives do attempt escape during cold months, their need for assistance becomes even more critical. Sarah must maintain constant readiness to provide shelter, food, medical care, and guidance, even during periods when no travelers are expected, because the difference between preparedness and unpreparedness can literally mean the difference between life and death for those seeking freedom. The relationship between weather patterns and Underground Railroad security creates a complex calculus that influences every aspect of operational planning. Heavy snowfall can provide concealment for movements between safe houses, but it also creates tracks that can be followed by pursuers and makes travel extremely dangerous for people who lack adequate clothing and shelter. Ice storms can make roads impassable for slave catchers traveling by horseback or wagon, but they also prevent fugitives from making progress toward safety. Sarah and her fellow conductors must develop contingency plans for every type of weather condition, ensuring that they can provide appropriate assistance regardless of the specific challenges that nature presents. The long winter evenings provide opportunities for extended quilting sessions that serve multiple purposes within the Underground Railroad network. These gatherings allow for detailed planning of spring and summer operations, but increased travel will require more extensive coordination between stations along the escape routes. The women use these meetings to refine their coding systems, develop new patterns that can convey more specific information, can train newer participants in the sophisticated skills required for effective Underground Railroad communication. The combination of practical needlework, instruction, and clandestine operational planning creates an atmosphere of purposeful activity that sustains morale during the difficult winter months. As spring arrives in southeastern Pennsylvania, bringing with it the promise of renewed Underground Railroad activity, Sarah McKinnon prepares for what she knows will be the most dangerous and demanding season of her clandestine career. The warming, whether that makes travel easier for fugitive slaves, also increases the activity of professional slave catchers, federal marshals enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, and local authorities who have become suspicious of the unusual patterns of movement in their area. The quilts that Sarah hangs on her clothesline during these crucial months must convey increasingly complex information about safe routes, dangerous areas, and the timing of assistance while maintaining the appearance of normal domestic activity that will not attract unwanted official attention. The bear's paw pattern that Sarah completes during the early weeks of spring carries multiple layers of coded information, essential for the success of escape attempts planned for the coming months. The traditional design, featuring repeated motifs that suggest the rough pads of a bear's foot, can be modified to indicate specific types of terrain that travelers will encounter along different routes northward. Sharp pointed elements within the pattern worn of mountainous areas where foot travel will be particularly difficult, while rounded shapes suggest river valleys where walking will be easier, but where the risk of encounters with authorities may be higher. The arrangement of light and dark fabrics within each bear's paw block provides directional information. with the positioning of colors indicating where the particular routes should be approached from east or west, and whether certain landmarks should be passed on the right or left. The network of women who participate in the Underground Railroad's quilting communication system has expanded during the winter months as word of their activities has spread carefully through trusted channels to other families committed to the anti-slavery cause. Mrs. Hannah Whitmore, whose family operates a mill several miles to the north, has learned to create patterns that can indicate the availability of transportation by wagon or boat for travelers who are too injured or exhausted to continue on foot. Her position near the river provides her with intelligence about water routes that can offer alternatives to overland travel, but that also present their own specific dangers from patrol boats and customs officials who monitor river traffic for suspicious activity. The integration of new participants into the coding system requires extensive training that must be conducted with absolute secrecy and perfect discretion. Sarah has developed teaching methods that allow her to instruct other women in the symbolic language of Underground Railroad quilts while maintaining the appearance of normal needlework education. A lesson about color coordination in traditional quilt patterns becomes an opportunity to explain how fabric choices can convey information about seasonal travel conditions, while instruction in geometric design principles provides cover for teaching the spatial relationships that indicate safe directions of travel and dangerous areas to avoid. The spring season brings renewed urgency to Underground Railroad operations as improved weather conditions create opportunities for large-scale escape attempts that require coordinated assistance from multiple stations along the route to freedom. Sarah's correspondence with other conductors, carefully disguised as normal social communication between rural neighbors, reveals the scope of the preparations required to support these ambitious undertakings. A letter ostensibly discussing plans for a church social actually contains detailed intelligence about the timing of group escapes, the resources required to support larger numbers of travelers, and the specific types of assistance that will be needed at different points along the journey. The children's education in Underground Railroad security protocols becomes even more critical during spring months when increased activity creates greater opportunities for discovery by hostile observers. Rebecca McKinnon, now 17 and increasingly trusted with important responsibilities, has learned to create complex quilt patterns that can convey detailed information about specific escape routes while appearing to casual observers is simply the work of a talented young needlewoman. Her ability to translate operational intelligence into symbolic form and to interpret coded messages created by other Underground Railroad participants has made her an invaluable asset to the network's communication system. The physical modifications to the McKinnon property that enabled them to shelter fugitive slaves must be expanded and improved to accommodate the increased traffic expected during the spring travel season. Thomas McKinnon has constructed additional concealed spaces in their barn that can provide temporary shelter for larger groups of travelers, while maintaining the appearance of normal farm storage that will not attract attention from casual observers or even systematic searches by authorities who lack specific knowledge of the hiding places' locations. The root cellar beneath their kitchen has been further modified to include ventilation systems that can support human occupancy for extended periods when circumstances require travelers to remain hidden for days rather than hours. The medical preparations required for treating fugitive slaves become more sophisticated as Sarah and her fellow conductors anticipate the specific types of injuries and illnesses that will result from increased travel during spring months. The wet conditions common during early spring create particular risks of respiratory ailments and infected wounds, while the uneven terrain that provides concealment from pursuers also increases the likelihood of injuries from falls and encounters with wild animals. Sarah's medical supplies now include treatments specifically chosen for addressing these seasonal health challenges, obtained through careful negotiations with sympathetic physicians and apothecaries who provide assistance while maintaining plausible deniability about the ultimate purpose of their medical advice. The financial resources required to support expanded Underground Railroad operations during spring months create challenges that extend throughout the anti-slavery community in southeastern Pennsylvania. The costs of providing food, clothing, medical care, and transportation for increased numbers of fugitive slaves strain the budgets of families who are already sacrificing their own comfort to support the cause of freedom. Sarah participates in an informal economy of mutual aid that allows Underground Railroad conductors to share these financial burdens here through systems of barter and exchange that operate alongside their regular commercial activities. The relationship between Underground Railroad operations and the broader anti-slavery movement becomes more complex during spring months when increased publicity about escapes and rescues attracts attention from both supporters and opponents of the Freedom Network. Sarah must navigate carefully between maintaining the secrecy required for effective clandestine operations and supporting the public education efforts that help build political support for anti-slavery causes. Her correspondence with women involved in formal anti-slavery societies requires constant attention to language that can express solidarity with their goals, while avoiding explicit references to illegal activities that could endanger Underground Railroad participants. The seasonal rhythms of farm life provide both opportunities and challenges for Underground Railroad operations during spring months. The increased activity associated with planting and early cultivation creates natural cover for movements between safe houses and for the transportation of supplies needed to support fugitive slaves. However, the longer daylight hours that facilitate farm work also reduce the periods of darkness available for concealing the movement of travelers, requiring conductors to develop more sophisticated timing and coordination for their assistance activities. The psychological toll of Underground Railroad participation becomes particularly intense during spring months when the increased pace of operations creates constant stress about the safety of fugitive slaves, the security of the network, and the possibility of discovery by hostile authorities. Sarah has learned to manage this stress through her religious faith and through the support of other women who share her commitment to human freedom. But the emotional burden of knowing that her decisions could determine whether other human beings achieve freedom or face recapture and punishment continues to weigh heavily on her conscience. The communication systems that link Underground Railroad stations across the region must adapt to spring conditions that bring both opportunities and dangers for the transmission of coded information. The increased travel associated with spring farm activities provides natural cover for messages carrying intelligence between different conductors. But the improved weather conditions also enable more extensive patrolling by authorities seeking to disrupt Underground Railroad operations. Sarah and her fellow conductors must develop new methods for sharing critical information that can operate effectively even when traditional communication channels become compromised or dangerous. The preservation of quilts carrying coded messages becomes more challenging during spring months when the increased display of these textiles creates greater opportunities for their observation by potentially hostile observers. Sarah has developed techniques for timing the public exhibition of coded quilts to coincide with periods when their messages will be most useful to fugitive slaves, while minimizing the risk of detection by slave catchers or other authorities. The strategic use of washing days and seasonal cleaning activities provides natural justification for hanging quilts where their coded messages can be observed by those who need to receive them. The training of new Underground Railroad participants reaches its peak during spring months when the anticipated increase in escape attempts requires expanded networks of assistance and communication. Sarah's role as an experienced conductor includes responsibility for educating newer participants in the complex skills required for effective Underground Railroad operations. This education must cover not only the technical aspects of creating and interpreting coded quilt patterns, but also the security protocols, medical knowledge, and psychological resilience required for successful participation in activities that involve constant danger and enormous moral responsibility. As we move from the hidden networks of resistance to the glittering surfaces of elite Southern society, imagine yourself stepping through the grand entrance of Magnolia Grove Plantation in Central Georgia on a warm evening in May 1860. The setting: sun casts long shadows across the carefully manicured grounds, while inside the imposing Greek Revival mansion, preparations are underway for what will prove to be one of the last great social gatherings of the antebellum South. The contrast between this world of orchestrated elegance and the harsh realities that sustain it creates an atmosphere of beautiful fragility, where the elaborate rituals of aristocratic leisure mask the fundamental contradictions that will soon tear this society apart. The ballroom of Magnolia Grove represents the pinnacle of Southern plantation architecture. Its soaring ceilings, supported by columns crafted from Georgia marble, its walls adorned with silk wallpaper imported from France, and its floors polished to a mirror-like finish that reflects the light of dozens of crystal chandeliers. This space, designed to showcase the wealth and refinement of the plantation's owners, the Whitfield family, serves as a stage where the elaborate performance of Southern gentility plays out against a backdrop of enforced labor and systematic oppression that remains carefully invisible to the evening's guests. Margaret Whitfield, the plantation's mistress, moves through her domain with the practiced grace of someone who has spent her entire life learning to embody the ideals of Southern womanhood. Her silk gown, created by enslaved seamstresses whose extraordinary skill remains unacknowledged in the official accounts of the evening's preparations, represents months of careful planning and execution. The intricate embroidery that adorns her dress required countless hours of painstaking work by women whose own clothing consists of rough cotton fabric, distributed according to utilitarian necessity rather than aesthetic consideration. The guests who gather for this evening's festivities represent the cream of Georgia's planter society, families whose wealth has been built through generations of cotton cultivation and whose social position depends upon their ability to maintain the elaborate fiction that their prosperity results from inherent superiority rather than systematic exploitation of human labor. Their conversations, conducted in the refined accents and sophisticated vocabulary that mark their class position, carefully avoid direct reference to the source of their wealth while celebrating the cultural achievements that their economic system has made possible. The music that fills the ballroom comes from a small orchestra of enslaved musicians whose extraordinary talent has been cultivated not for their own artistic fulfillment but for their master's entertainment. The violin melodies that provide the soundtrack for the evening's dancing represent a complex fusion of European classical traditions with African musical elements that have survived the Middle Passage and generations of cultural suppression. These musicians' names will never appear in the society pages that chronicle this evening's festivities, possess conservatory-level skills that have been developed through informal networks of teaching and learning that operate entirely outside the recognition of white society. The elaborate dining arrangements that precede the evening's dancing showcase the sophisticated domestic organization that characterizes the most successful plantations. The china, crystal, and silver that grace the dining tables represent international trade networks that connect Georgia cotton fields to European markets. While the elaborate menu features dishes that require not only expensive imported ingredients, but also the highly specialized culinary skills of enslaved cooks whose expertise has been developed through years of experience, serving the refined tastes of their owners and guests. The social rituals that govern this evening's gathering reflect a complex system of status, distinctions, and behavioral expectations that have evolved to reinforce the hierarchical organization of Southern society. The order in which guests are introduced, the seating arrangements at dinner, the selection of dancing partners, and even the topics considered appropriate for conversation all serve to affirm existing power relationships while creating the appearance of natural aristocratic order that masks the violent foundations upon which this social system rests. Young Charles Whitfield, heir to the plantation and recently graduated from the University of Virginia, represents the next generation of Southern leadership, educated in classical literature and political philosophy, but shielded from meaningful contact with the moral contradictions that define his inheritance. His conversations with other young men of his class reveal a worldview that combines genuine intellectual sophistication with complete blindness to the humanity of the enslaved people who sustained their way of life. These young men discuss the latest European novels and political developments with impressive erudition while remaining oblivious to the suffering that occurs within sight of their ballroom windows. The women who participate in this evening's festivities have been trained from childhood in the elaborate performance of Southern femininity, which requires them to project an image of delicate refinement while actually managing complex domestic operations that depend upon their ability to supervise and control the labor of enslaved people. Their conversations about fashion, literature, and social engagements serve multiple purposes. They provide appropriate entertainment for mixed company while also creating opportunities for sharing information about domestic management techniques and social strategies that help maintain their privileged position within the plantation system. As the evening progresses and the dancing reaches its height, the ballroom of Magnolia Grove becomes a stage where the elaborate performance of Southern civilization plays out with increasing intensity, as if the participants sense unconsciously that their world stands on the edge of fundamental transformation. The swirling gowns and tailored evening wear create patterns of movement that mirror the complex social choreography governing every aspect of plantation society, while the music provided by enslaved musicians carries undertones of cultural traditions that speak to experiences entirely outside the comprehension of those who benefit from their artistic labor. The conversations that flow around the edges of the dancing reveal the intellectual currents and political tensions that will soon erupt into open conflict. Though the evening's participants discuss these matters with the detached sophistication of people who believe themselves immune to the consequences of historical change, the recent election of Abraham Lincoln provides a frequent topic of discussion, the men expressing varying degrees of concern about the new president's potential policies regarding slavery expansion, while maintaining the confident assumption that Southern political influence will ultimately prevail in any serious confrontation with Northern interests. Margaret Whitfield moves through her role as hostess with the practiced skill of someone who has learned to manage the complex social dynamics that characterize gatherings of the Southern elite, ensuring that conversations remain appropriately lighthearted, while subtly steering discussion away from topics that might create uncomfortable tensions among her guests. Her ability to maintain this delicate balance reflects years of training in the sophisticated social management skills that enable plantation mistresses to preserve the illusion of harmonious community while presiding over a system built upon fundamental conflicts of interest between different groups within Southern society. The younger generation of plantation heirs who participate in this evening's festivities bring to their social interactions a combination of traditional Southern values and new ideas acquired through education at universities that expose them to broader intellectual currents. Charles Whitfield and his contemporaries discussed the latest European political developments and American literary achievements with genuine sophistication. Yet their worldview remains fundamentally shaped by assumptions about racial hierarchy and the naturalness of slavery that prevent them from perceiving the moral contradictions inherent in their social position. The elaborate refreshments served throughout the evening represent not only the plantation's wealth, but also the sophisticated culinary traditions that have developed within the enslaved community. Traditions that combine African cooking techniques with European ingredients and presentation styles to create distinctive regional cuisines. The enslaved cooks whose skills make these refreshments possible possess knowledge that has been accumulated through generations of experimentation and refinement. Yet, their contributions to Southern culture remain unacknowledged by the society that benefits from their expertise. The ballroom's atmosphere becomes increasingly charged as the evening progresses. The combination of music, dancing, and elaborate social ritual, creating a sense of heightened intensity that reflects the unconscious awareness that this way of life faces unprecedented challenges. The guests' behavior becomes more animated and their conversations more passionate as the night advances, as if they are trying to extract maximum pleasure from entertainments that may not continue indefinitely. This underlying tension manifests itself in more elaborate displays of wealth and refinement, more intense flirtations and romantic pursuits, and more emphatic assertions of Southern cultural superiority. The enslaved house servants, who move invisibly through the ballroom, refilling glasses and clearing away empty plates, witness these displays of elite culture from a unique perspective that allows them to observe the contradictions and hypocrisies that remain invisible to the participants themselves. Their presence as silent observers of these intimate social rituals provides them with detailed knowledge about the personalities, relationships, and private concerns of their owners, knowledge that circulates through the enslaved community and contributes to their understanding of the social forces that shape their own lives. The music that provides the soundtrack for the evening's dancing reflects the complex cultural fusion that characterizes Southern artistic traditions, with enslaved musicians interpreting European classical compositions through the filter of African musical sensibilities that have survived centuries of cultural suppression. The rhythmic patterns and melodic variations that these musicians introduce into their performances speak to musical traditions that predate their enslavement. Yet their artistic expression must conform to the aesthetic preferences of their owners and remain within boundaries that do not challenge the social order that defines their legal status. The architectural setting of Magnolia Grove's ballroom creates an environment designed to reinforce the social hierarchies that define plantation society, with the physical arrangement of space reflecting and reproducing the power relationships that characterize the broader social system. The elevated platform where the musicians perform literally places them above the dancing guests while simultaneously marking their social invisibility. The strategic placement of doorways and corridors ensures that enslaved servants can move efficiently through the space while remaining as inconspicuous as possible during their duties. As the clock approaches midnight and the evening's festivities reach their crescendo, the ballroom of Magnolia Grove becomes a kind of temporal capsule, preserving for one final moment a way of life that stands on the precipice of historical extinction. The guests, their faces flushed with wine and exertion from dancing, move through the elaborate social rituals of plantation society with an intensity that speaks to their unconscious awareness that they are participating in something that may never be repeated in quite the same way. The laughter that echoes through the high-ceilinged space carries undertones of defiance and desperation, as if the participants are trying to ward off the future through the sheer force of their commitment to tradition and refinement. The conversations that flow around the edges of the ballroom reveal the fault lines that will soon fracture Southern society, though the evening's participants discuss these tensions with a confident, assumption that their superior culture and military tradition will ultimately prevail in any conflict with Northern industrial society. The men speak increasingly of honor, duty, and the necessity of defending Southern institutions against what they perceive as Northern aggression, while the women express their confidence in the courage and capability of their husbands and sons to protect the world that has nurtured them since birth. Charles Whitfield, emboldened by the evening's wine and the admiring attention of several young women, holds forth on the superiority of Southern civilization and the natural hierarchy that places educated white men at the apex of social organization. His eloquent defense of slavery as a positive good that benefits both masters and enslaved people reflects the sophisticated intellectual framework that the planter class has developed to justify their social position. A framework that combines genuine learning with profound moral blindness in ways that will soon prove tragically inadequate to the challenges history is about to present. The enslaved musicians who provide the soundtrack for these final hours of the ball continue their complex cultural performance, interpreting European dance music through the filter of African musical traditions, while maintaining the careful emotional restraint required to avoid any suggestion of independent, cantic expression that might challenge their assigned role as invisible servants. Their music carries layers of meaning that remain inaudible to the dancing guests' rhythmic patterns that connect to ancestral traditions, melodic variations that speak to experiences of loss and endurance, harmonic structures that reflect the musical sophistication of cultures that slavery has attempted to destroy but never completely silence. Margaret Whitfield surveys her domain with the satisfaction of someone who has successfully orchestrated a social event that will be remembered and discussed throughout the region for months to come. Yet, her pleasure is tinged with an indefinable anxiety that speaks to her intuitive understanding that the world she has worked so hard to master may be entering a period of unprecedented instability. Her role as plantation mistress has required her to develop extraordinary skills in managing complex social relationships and maintaining the delicate balance between authority and benevolence that characterizes successful paternalistic control. But these skills may prove inadequate to the challenges that await Southern society in the coming years. The architectural grandeur of Magnolia Grove's ballroom serves as a monument to the cultural achievements that the plantation system has made possible. Yet this very grandeur speaks to the enormous concentration of wealth and labor required to create spaces dedicated entirely to leisure and display. The imported marble columns, hand-carved moldings, and crystal chandeliers represent the artistic labor of craftsmen from around the world, while the polished floors and silk-covered walls reflect the domestic labor of enslaved people whose aesthetic sensibility and technical skill remain unacknowledged by those who benefit from their work. The garden terraces that extend beyond the ballroom's tall windows create outdoor spaces where some guests seek relief from the intensity of the indoor festivities, and where more intimate conversations take place under the gentle illumination of paper lanterns and torches. These conversations, conducted in the softer tones appropriate to romantic encounters and private confidences, nevertheless reveal the same underlying tensions that characterize the more public discussions inside the ballroom. Anxiety about political developments, concern about economic pressures, and growing uncertainty about the sustainability of a social system that has provided the foundation for everything they consider valuable in life. The elaborate refreshment tables that line one wall of the ballroom display the products of a sophisticated culinary tradition that represents one of the most complex cultural achievements of the plantation system. Combining European cooking techniques with African ingredients and preparation methods to create a distinctive regional cuisine, the enslaved cooks whose expertise makes this feast possible possess knowledge that has been accumulated through generations of experimentation and refinement. Yet their contributions to Southern culture remain invisible to the guests who consume their creations while discussing the inherent superiority of white civilization. The generational tensions that exist within the planter class become apparent in the subtle differences between the conversations of older and younger guests, with the established plantation owners expressing greater caution about the political challenges facing Southern society, while their sons and heirs speak with characteristic youthful confidence about their ability to defend their inheritance through military action if necessary. These differences reflect not only the natural optimism of youth, but also the different historical experiences that have shaped each generation's understanding of their social position and its vulnerability to external challenge. As we emerge from these 4 journeys through the landscapes of Civil War America, let yourself take a moment to appreciate the quiet comfort of your present surroundings, the safety of your bed, the warmth of your shelter, the freedom from the immediate concerns that define daily existence for those who lived through that transformative period in American history. The distance that separates us from their experiences is measured not only in years, but in the fundamental changes to human society that their struggles and sacrifices helped bring about. Changes that have created the world of expanded freedom and enhanced security within which we now live our own lives. The Henderson family, to whom we met in their modest farmhouse near the shifting battle lines of Virginia, represents the millions of ordinary Americans who discovered reserves of courage and adaptability they never knew they possessed when circumstances demanded extraordinary responses to unprecedented challenges. Their story reminds us that the great movements of history are built upon countless individual decisions made by people who often had no way of knowing how their choices would contribute to larger patterns of change, but who, nevertheless, chose to act according to their understanding of right and wrong, even when such choices required significant personal sacrifice. Sarah McKinnon and her fellow conductors on the Underground Railroad demonstrate the power of ordinary domestic skills when they are guided by moral conviction and sustained by networks of mutual support and shared commitment. The quilts that Sarah stitched by lamplight, with their coded messages of direction and hope, speak to the countless ways that resistance to oppression can emerge from the most unlikely sources and operate through the most subtle methods, creating systems of liberation that remain invisible to those in power while providing essential assistance to those seeking freedom. Abraham Lincoln, writing alone in his study during the final weeks of his presidency, embodied the solitary burden of democratic leadership during times of national crisis, when the decisions of a single individual can determine the fate of millions and the direction of historical development for generations to come. His private reflections revealed the complex moral reasoning and emotional cost that accompanied the exercise of supreme responsibility, while his vision of national reunion and expanded freedom provided the intellectual framework that would guide American development long after his own life was cut short by an assassin's bullet. The Plantation Ballroom at Magnolia Grove, with its glittering chandeliers and polished floors, its elaborate entertainments and refined conversations, serves as a reminder that some of history's greatest evils have been sustained by people who were capable of genuine cultural achievement and sincere personal affection, but who remained trapped within social systems that corrupted their moral vision and prevented them from perceiving the full humanity of those whom their prosperity depended upon oppressing. The beauty and elegance of their world could not ultimately protect them from the moral reckoning that their choices had made inevitable. These 4 perspectives on Civil War America's anxious vigilance of families caught between opposing armies, the coded resistance of Underground Railroad networks, the lonely responsibility of presidential leadership, and the doomed elegance of plantation society together create a portrait of a nation discovering the true meaning of its founding principles through the painful process of civil conflict. Each of these experiences speaks to different aspects of the human condition under stress, our capacity for adaptation and endurance, our ability to create networks of mutual support and resistance, our potential for moral growth and visionary leadership, our tendency to become trapped within systems that corrupt our better impulses. The transformation that these individual and collective experiences produced extends far beyond the immediate political and legal changes that resulted from Union victory and slave emancipation. The Civil War generation learned lessons about human equality, democratic governance, and moral responsibility that would influence American development for more than a century afterward. While their failures and limitations would continue to create challenges that subsequent generations would be forced to address through their own forms of struggle and sacrifice, the courage displayed by people like the Henderson family Sarah McKinnon, Abraham Lincoln, and even those enslaved people who endured the oppression symbolized by plantation ballrooms, reminds us that ordinary human beings possess extraordinary potential for moral growth and heroic action when circumstances demand such responses. Their stories suggest that each generation faces its own forms of crisis and opportunity, its own requirements for adaptation and resistance, its own needs for visionary leadership and moral courage. As you settle deeper into the comfort of your bed and allow these historical voices to fade into the peaceful silence of your modern surroundings, carry with you the knowledge that the freedom and security you enjoy were purchased through the struggles of people who faced challenges that tested every aspect of their humanity. Their experiences remind us that progress toward justice and equality is never automatic or inevitable, but must be achieved through the conscious choices and sustained efforts of individuals who understand that their own welfare is inseparably connected to the welfare of their fellow human beings. The quiet that surrounds you now is made possible by the noise of distant battles, the whispered conversations in Underground Railroad safe houses, the scratch of Lincoln's pen across paper in his midnight study, and the rustling of silk gowns in ballrooms that would soon be consumed by the fires of social revolution. Their struggles have become your peace. Their uncertainties have become your security. Their courage has become your inheritance, an inheritance that comes with responsibilities. To continue their work of building a society worthy of the sacrifices they made and the dreams they nurtured, even in the darkest hours of national crisis. Rest now in the knowledge that their stories live on not only in the historical record, but in the institutions and freedoms that shape your daily life, and that the peace you enjoy tonight stands as testimony to their conviction that human beings, despite all their limitations and failures, possess the capacity to learn from their mistakes, to grow beyond their prejudices, and to create forms of society that better reflect the highest aspirations of the human spirit. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of a continuing story that began long before your birth and will continue long after your own voice has joined the chorus of those who have passed into history, but whose influence continues to shape the world through the example of their lives and the consequences of their choices. The economic impact of Underground Railroad participation becomes particularly apparent during winter, when the costs of heating additional space, feeding unexpected guests, and providing winter clothing for travelers places significant strain on family budgets. The McKinnon family has learned to manage these expenses through careful planning and community cooperation, but the financial burden remains a constant concern that influences their decisions about everything from household purchases to farm operations. The quilting circles provide venues for sharing not only the direct costs of Underground Railroad operations, but also the economic risks associated with potential legal prosecution and social ostracism that could destroy their livelihood if their activities were discovered by unsympathetic authorities.